Have you ever finished watching a movie and thought, this is great, can't wait for the sequel? And then when you actually saw the sequel, you said to yourself, man, they really should have left this alone after one? Well then this is the show for you. Welcome to Sequelpalooza.
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 Sequel.
The series that takes a hit movie, asks what happened next, and discovers that it's usually a complete and utter mess. In each episode, we'll be telling the story of a different film series from across the decades. And today, in the year of the 20th anniversary of the release of one of Hollywood's most disliked sequels, we're hurtling headfirst into the belly of the beast, Son of the Mask. In 1994, The Mask became an unexpected blockbuster, helping to take Jim Carrey from just another comedian to a gold-plated superstar, and introducing the world to Cameron Diaz. A sequel was inevitable, but it's mind-bending to attempt to understand how they got that follow-up so wrong. More than a decade on from the smash hit original, Son of the Mask replaced Carrey with Jamie Kennedy and completely tanked the series, delivering a critical and commercial disaster considered amongst the worst major studio films ever made. Where exactly does the blame lie for Son of the Mask becoming such an iconic example of follow-up film excess? Was Jim Carrey's 1994 run actually amongst the best single years any movie star has ever managed? And how bad does the reaction to a film have to be for its star to make a feature-length documentary about it?
She's right, man. It's Sunday. Get noticed. I'll be in the car.
Ooh, somebody should have stopped them. This is Sequelpalooza. As the world headed into the sweltering heat of the summer of '94, the USA hosted the World Cup for the very first time, bringing with it huge TV audiences and some very poorly taken opening ceremony penalty kicks. Meanwhile, on TV, Seinfeld, Home Improvement and The X-Files had been dominating screens for the first half of the year, and Friends and ER were both waiting in the wings to debut in September. The passing of Kurt Cobain in April had been huge news in the music world, and although grunge was still popular, hip-hop and R&B were beginning to take an ever-increasing grip on the charts. It wasn't all cool though. The biggest song of the summer was that future school disco slow dance favourite, I Swear, by All For One. At the cinema, The Lion King was becoming the peak of the Disney Renaissance and would be the year's highest grossing movie, closely followed by Tom Hanks in Forrest Gump, another huge hit. A major cultural phenomenon would be unveiled at the Cannes Film Festival in May, when a video store manager turned director's second film took home the Palme d'Or. Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction would have a huge impact across the movie business after it was rolled out to cinemas in October. A more reserved revelation had arrived in March, when a small-budgeted British comedy called Four Weddings and a Funeral had also stunned Hollywood, going on to make over $245 million in cinemas. Another very different type of comedy proved an unexpected smash hit in early '94, introducing the wider world to Jim Carrey. Ace Ventura: Pet Detective had taken him from a Canadian comedian known by some as a cast member of the TV show In Living Color to one of Hollywood's hottest stars. Grossing more than $107 million in cinemas, it had also gone on to sell over 4 million VHS copies in its first 3 weeks on release. A vital stat for an industry increasingly valuing the long tail provided by video sales. Watching this unfold were the no doubt delighted producers of Carrey's follow-up movie, a film which had been made in late 1993 when he was still an unknown cinematic quantity. The fact that he had proved you could carry a movie to major success was fantastic news for upstart studio New Line Cinema, the studio behind Carrey's second movie of 1994, The Mask. Although I had no concept of this in my mid-90s youth, it began life as a comic book character which had first appeared in various forms in the 1980s before being reworked into a standalone series for Dark Horse Comics in 1989. Darker than the movie, it would eventually inspire discussions between Dark Horse founder Mike Richardson and various Hollywood studios about turning the horror comedy comic into its own movie had taken place before New Line gave the film the green light to go into production in late 1992 under director Chuck Russell. Russell had seemed an obvious choice for New Line, given they had envisaged The Mask as the start of a new horror franchise, and he had directed both A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and the remake of The Blob in the late 80s. But their chosen director, who had also written 1984's highly underrated Dreamscape, surprised them by electing to take The Mask in a less horror-tinged direction. New Line was looking at The Mask as a low-budget horror franchise, but I felt it could be much more than that. The original comic was very dark and violent, but I saw the potential for a wild, fun, and visually inventive film instead. So Russell worked with screenwriter Mike Werb to shape The Mask into something new, dialing down the ultra-violence and allowing it to become, in Russell's words, something that combined Tex Avery-style cartoon physics with live action. To make this a reality, aside from groundbreaking special effects from Industrial Light and Magic, it wouldn't be possible to deliver without the right leading man. Numerous established names were either discussed or considered for the lead role, from Robin Williams to Martin Short and Matthew Broderick to Nicolas Cage. But Russell had seen Jim Carrey's comedy live in person and considered him the perfect choice for the role. He even ensured that the script was crafted specifically to make the most of Carrey's physical comedy skills. That script told the story of Carrey's character Stanley Ipkiss, a bank clerk who gets bullied by basically everyone. His life is changed forever when he discovers a wooden mask which transforms him into his yellow-suited, green-faced alter ego, The Mask, bestowed with magical powers and ready to cause some mischief. Embracing his newfound confidence and capabilities, Stanley uses The Mask to turn his life around, partying and getting revenge on those who've wronged him. But he soon attracts the attention of the police, as well as a local mobster who wants The Mask for himself, and his girlfriend, club singer Tina, who both versions of Stanley have fallen for. As the chaos escalates, Stanley needs to work out whether he can face his problems, with or without The Mask. The cast was filled out by the likes of Peter Riger and Amy Yazbek as a police officer and reporter on the trail of The Mask, with Peter Green as the ambitious gangster. For the key role of Tina and Stanley's love interest, the original choice was Anna Nicole Smith, but she bailed last minute to make Naked Gun 33 1/3 instead. In the end, the part went to 21-year-old model Cameron Diaz in her very first film role. Sometimes in life things work out for the best, and this, despite Diaz only taking acting lessons after she got the job, was definitely one of those times. With the cast in place, The Mask went into production, with filming commencing in August and wrapping in October of 1993 across Los Angeles. The special effects work by ILM and DreamQuest Images were a pretty revolutionary blend of live action and CGI to create exaggerated, cartoonish visuals. ILM told Russell that Carrey's ability to create uniquely expressive and elasticated facial expressions reduced the overall effects budget by around $1 million. The star would spend around 4 hours a day in makeup alone, with a costume that included fake teeth that Carrey was supposed to take out for dialogue. Showing his dedication to the role, he managed to learn to wear them whilst talking anyway. The film working would be absolutely dictated by the relationship between Carrey and the visual effects, and thankfully, rather than looking awkward, it ended up pretty magical. It was rightly nominated for a Best Visual Effects Oscar and still looks impressive today, more than 30 years on. Early test screenings for The Mask reportedly went well, and New Line execs, along with producer Bob Engelman, who had recently overseen films like Mr. Nanny starring Hulk Hogan and Revenge of the Nerds 3, began to realise they might have a surprise hit on their hands. Critical reaction was pretty positive too, if not overwhelmingly so. Though its groundbreaking effects and Carrey's performance were generally acknowledged across the board, the New York Times called it an astonishingly lazy and perfunctory effort, and the Chicago Reader noted that the results are easy to watch, though awfully familiar and simple-minded. Some critics got it though, and both Siskel and Ebert were praising of the film's pretty undeniable charms.
Jim Carrey, he of the annoying overbite, is back in action as the Mask, and I have to admit it, I enjoyed a lot of this film.
We didn't like Ace Ventura, and so
Right.
you probably walked into this movie with a kind of a negative attitude, and maybe
No, I
did
don't.
too.
As a matter of
But
fact, I don't.
I feel that Jim Carrey is extremely important to the success of this movie, and that somebody else in that character might not have done as good a job. And you give
I think
credit
that's
to
true.
everyone, to special effects, to Cameron Diaz, who was beautiful, to the dog, who was very funny. Why
Yeah.
not give some credit to the guy who plays the title
I would-
role?
As soon as it hit cinemas on July 29th, 1994, audiences made The Mask a movie sensation. Though its debut at the #1 spot only lasted 1 week, knocked off the top in its second week by the release of Clear and Present Danger, it would remain in North American cinemas for the rest of the year, and as it was rolled out across the world, continued to build momentum. Eventually pulling in over $351 million at the worldwide box office, it would be the 4th highest grossing film of 1994. Not bad for a film with an $18 million budget from a horror franchise director who hadn't released a movie in cinemas in years. Sometimes in life, timing is everything. Carrey, who had been established with Ace Ventura, was instantly sent to another level of fame. Diaz, from her very first role, was a household name. Russell had directed a legitimate blockbuster movie, and New Line Cinema, which had been bought by Turner for $500 million in January of '94, thought they had a brand new money-printing franchise on their hands. The Mask became part of the zeitgeist, with its dialogue and aesthetic regularly referenced across pop culture. The film connected in a way nobody could have been confident it would. A sequel was inevitable. The only problem was, their newly minted superstar made it clear he didn't want anything to do with a follow-up, telling Barbara Walters on network TV in early 1995 that he had been offered $10 million flat to return to the sequel, just a slight increase on the sub $500,000 he had received for the original, but in the end, deciding to pass on the project. Aside from anything else, Carrey turning New Line down ruined an already launched Nintendo Power Magazine contest to win a walk-on part in The Mask 2. How could you, Jim? Everything was okay though, right? New Line really wanted a sequel, and even if Carrey might not agree to make it, the second Mask film couldn't turn out that badly, could it? Could it? Hello? Whisper it, but was Jim Carrey's 1994 one of the best years an actor has ever had in Hollywood? Or possibly even the best? Sounds crazy, but I think you could definitely argue the case for it. Sure, details can be debated until the cows come home, but from a standing start for a largely unknown name, it must be a contender. I mean, he didn't just have one hit, he backed it up straight away with 2 more, even bigger ones. Carrey started 1994 with Ace Ventura in February, followed it with The Mask in July, and ended it with Dumb and Dumber in December. These 3 films alone made more than $700 million in 1994's cinemas and became instant smashes on video as well, with all 3 spawning Carrey-less animated series the following year. To top that all off, before the release of Dumb and Dumber, he'd been offered $20 million to take on the role of the Joker in Batman Forever in 1995. In January of '94, he had essentially been unknown to most mainstream audiences, seen by a small percentage of viewers in the likes of In Living Color and Earth Girls Are Easy. In double quick time though, he was not just a popular comedian, but one of the most famous and bankable actors in Hollywood. An unbelievable rise in such a short time, but one which was absolutely backed up by the data. Where would you say Jim Carrey's breakout year ranks amongst the all-time list? Can you think of anyone who has had a better single 12 months? It has to be right up there, surely. And if thought-provoking questions like this keep you up at night, then maybe consider subscribing to Culture Slice. And now, on with the video. Live from Culture Slice Towers, it's Culture Slice Tonight, with your host, Culture Slice. Good evening and welcome to Culture Slice Tonight for February 14th, 2005. Happy Valentine's Day to all the lovers out there. Later on the show, the domain name youtube.com has been activated today for what will apparently be a new video sharing website. Will that go anywhere? Probably not. But first, The Mask finally has a sequel. Released this Friday in cinemas nationwide, Son of the Mask might not have the first movie star, or its director, or Cameron Diaz, or basically anything else. But New Line Cinema has bet close to $100 million that it can indeed repeat the trick. Early critical evaluations don't seem to hold out the same hope. Sorry, just remembering my late night entertainment news glory days for a second there. Anyway, it would be more than a decade after the first film had hit cinemas that a sequel to The Mask would actually see the light of day. Carrey's declining of the offer of a return stemmed from him not wanting to be typecast and the negative production experience he had struggled through on a sequel he did make, the critically derided but still very financially successful Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. Losing its main player was undeniably a major blow. Carrey almost couldn't miss in the 90s. Liar Liar topped $300 million in 97, and even films which were perceived as flops, like 1996's darker comedy The Cable Guy, were still profitable. He would even prove himself as a serious actor, with an almost insanely committed performance as Andy Kaufman in Man on the Moon, and his turn at the heart of 1998's The Truman Show, earning him critical plaudits. I still feel to this day that Carrey not getting a Best Actor Oscar nomination for either of them was a pretty huge oversight, but I should probably try to get over that someday. Director Chuck Russell had been interested in Part 2 at first and scoped out ideas on how to evolve the story, but without Carrey he bowed out of proceedings. He instead directed Arnold Schwarzenegger in Eraser, which made over $240 million for Warner Bros. In the summer of '96. Diaz would become a headliner of her own, with her star rising further thanks to the likes of My Best Friend's Wedding and There's Something About Mary. Without Jim Carrey, there was essentially no chance she would make a return for The Mask 2 though. Even if the trail for a feature-length follow-up went cold for a time, the wider Mask brand was still active in the latter part of the 90s. The Mask comic book continued to be a publishing success for Dark Horse, and the animated series ran through 3 seasons between 1995 and 1997. A Mask video game also arrived on the SNES in late '95, more than a year on from the release of the movie, with development taking so long that a Sega Genesis version was cancelled. The studio, now part of a far larger media empire, still wanted another film from the Mask universe though. In the early 2000s, various ideas were batted around for how to make the sequel work. The project eventually fell into the lap of director Lawrence Guterman, who had directed additional sequences on the first DreamWorks animation movie Ants and created a hit in his directorial debut proper, Cats and Dogs, which made over $200 million in 2001. Sure, it was quite a different vibe from Russell's resume prior to the first film, but Cats and Dogs did require considerable amounts of CGI work, and the family film had its moments too. Writer Lance Kazai had experience writing for Politically Incorrect and The Chevy Chase Show, but had never written a movie script before. His choice felt a bit baffling at the time, and given what the movie became, those suspicions were absolutely proved correct. Numerous recognizable names were said to be amongst the actors considered for the role of Tim Avery at various points, but the part, the vital replacement for missing in action Jim Carrey, ended up going to Jamie Kennedy. Kennedy's acting career had taken off when he landed a role in Scream and its sequels, and he'd also become a recognizable comedian who even landed his own show, The Jamie Kennedy Experiment. He'd written and starred in Malibu's Most Wanted in early 2003. which didn't get great reviews but did find an audience and turn a profit. As Kennedy tells it, he had a number of films in development after Malibu's Most Wanted had performed well, but the allure of starring in such a major movie sequel at the time was something he couldn't ignore. I had 2 projects I was going to do on my own. I had a movie where I was going to be one of 3 co-leads, or I had this huge franchise with a lot of risk. I don't know how much control I will have, potentially huge upside and be the star, and in the middle of the firestorm. But it's not Jim Carrey. With the potential for more movies and his career being taken to a new stratosphere, despite misgivings and concerns, Kennedy took the role. The Mask 2 went into production in mid-2003 and was filmed largely on sound stages in Australia between November of that year and April of 2004, with mid-filming rewrites and long drawn-out days on sets being the norm. The considerable amount of effects in the movie required a huge amount of work from Industrial Light and Magic, with even more baby and dog CGI scenes added after an apparently disastrous screening for execs of the first 2-hour cut of the movie. So what did Son of the Mask actually end up being about? Well, Kennedy's Avery, a nod to Tex Avery, is a cartoonist who dons the mask for a work party after his dog Otis finds it in a stream. He proceeds to have a night of partying in green and fathers a child with his wife Tonya, played by Trailer Howard. Not only is a baby boy later born with mask-like powers, but Otis the dog dons the mask as well and tries to get rid of him. Meanwhile, Loki, played by Alan Cumming, doing his best with very little, is searching for the missing mask under orders from his Norse godfather, Bob Hoskins Odin. This all leads to a crescendo of chaos, with CGI all over the place and slapstick aplenty, as Tim, Loki and the baby collide, and Son of the Mask becomes exhausting. Prior to release, Kennedy's concerns were clear to see, explaining on press tours that he wanted to be viewed as different to Jim Carrey's portrayal. Roger Moore to his Sean Connery, as he put it. Kennedy would years later recount that he knew the movie would be a disaster when he read the final shooting draft of the script. And watching the film, when you look into his eyes, you can kind of sense that in his performance. Before long, the rest of the world would share that same sense of dread. Son of the Mask was supposed to be a big hit from the very beginning. Not only did they budget more than $80 million for making this thing, but there was considerable marketing spend behind its release. All seemed set up for success, and then people actually started seeing it. I've read a lot of negative reviews in this series so far, but even for the world of Sequelpalooza, the critical analysis of Son of the Mask was brutal. From a witless and vulgar sequel to an irredeemable mess without wit, heart, or a single memorable performance, and loud, mean-spirited, and generally obnoxious, to one presumes the only thing worse than making this disaster is actually watching it. Wouldn't wish either on anyone. It was one horrific review after another.
This was almost a landmark for me in the 5 years I've been co-hosting the show. This is the closest I've ever come to walking out halfway through the film. And now that I look back on the experience, I wish I had. And here I thought Dumb and Dumberer was going to be the worst Jim Carrey-free sequel I'd see in my life. Believe it or not, Son of the Mask is even worse.
Yeah. To this wall of negativity, Son of the Mask made its way into North American cinemas on February 18th, 2005. Landing in 4th spot in its opening weekend behind other new arrivals Constantine and something called Because of Winn-Dixie, a film I have literally no memory of whatsoever. Takings dropped 50% in its second week on release, and the movie left the top 10 for good by its third. It only drew $17 million in the US and Canada, with international takings increasing things to just under $60 million worldwide, considerably below the movie's budget before any other costs were taken into account. It was DOA, a legendary flop and sequel disaster as soon as it was first screened. The most nominated film at that year's Razzie Awards, Son of the Mask was cursed to forever appear in various types of worst movie lists forevermore, and remains a bewildering, high-profile misfire of epic proportions. Kennedy, the poster boy for one of Hollywood's most notorious flops, largely returned to stand-up comedy and bit parts in the years that followed. His TV show had ended, and his 2007 comedy Kicking It Old School arrived to terrible box office and worse reviews. He would end up being inspired to make an entire documentary about the criticism he received that we'll be covering here very shortly. Lawrence Guterman, now with Son of the Mask on his CV, hasn't directed a film since. Aside from a 2012 TV movie called Bra League, Son of the Mask remains the only feature-length script on Lance Kazai's resume. Watching the sequel back so many years later, its complete and utter failure is as little of a surprise as it was then. The special effects are decent, but they're also as soulless as the rest of the film. The movie's over-reliance on them feels like an admission of there being so little else of value here. Kennedy being completely miscast in his role is actually one of the smaller issues in a film which manages to be both frantic and boring. Either way, it's a struggle to get through for sure. Apparently more than half an hour was cut from the final version of Son of the Mask, with what's left such a mess of CGI and chaos that it's kind of overwhelming. Maybe a more sympathetic recut could have at least allowed the film to make sense to the viewer. Or maybe it was simply beyond saving. Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Did You Know? On today's show, The Mask isn't the only movie that's a surprising comic book adaptation. Far from it. Did you know that plenty of movies you wouldn't expect started out as comics? Take The Rocketeer, Time Cop, Men in Black, Kingsman, Ghost World, A History of Violence, Road to Perdition, and even Bulletproof Monk. Yep, they're all films which originated as graphic stories before being flung onto the big screen. But 180s classic surprise comic book roots, for me, trumped the lot. Because did you know that John Hughes' iconic 1985 sci-fi teen comedy drama, Weird Science, is actually based on a comic? Because I didn't, but it's true.
What's Weird Science?
God. The film takes its name and basic concept from a sci-fi anthology published by EC Comics in the early 1950s, with the story of Maid of the Future revolving around a man who creates the perfect woman to be his wife. Producer Joel Silver bought the film rights for Weird Science in the early 80s, and Hughes then retooled the story to the one that we know and love. Well, at least I do. To base it around teens Wyatt and Gary's creation of Lisa, played brilliantly by Kelly LeBrock, to help change their fortunes in life. Seen by many at the time as a slightly odd misstep from a director at the peak of his 80s teen movie powers, Weird Science remains a unique film in Hughes' back catalogue 4 decades on from its release. Taking us back to the mid-90s, a TV series of Weird Science starring Vanessa Angel as Lisa debuted in 1994 and ran for 5 series. A film remake has been discussed for years, but who knows if that will ever go anywhere. Maybe that's for the best. In the meantime, as with any number of other unexpected memorable movie moments, we've got an obscure graphic story to thank for the film we got to see. Well, that's all we've got time for today. Join us next time on Did You Know? Making this episode of Sequelpalooza was a bit different when it came to researching Son of the Mask's disastrous birth. Jamie Kennedy has been so open about it that it took away at least some of the legwork. It also demonstrates how Son of the Mask has haunted him. Most stars of movie missteps run as far away from the film as possible, whereas Kennedy has done the opposite. I mean, a few years back he literally made his own YouTube series about the whole process of its making, and the reaction he received from it originally was a major contributing factor towards him making 2007's Heckler, a feature-length documentary in which he explores the relationship between performers and the criticism they receive from audiences and commentators. Heckler is a fascinating piece of media, featuring a crazy number of startlingly honest soundbites from recognizable faces. It never got much of a cinema release, which I can understand, but as a film, it's super fascinating to me. I guess you could in some way call me a critic, in that I attempt to analyze and critique films in my videos, so to see such a straight up response from someone starring in one of the most infamous of those movies is pretty unique. Even if it does descend into an anti-critic rant from Kennedy and others, Heckler is definitely worth seeking out. Whatever the state of Son of the Mask, Kennedy's candor in confronting his role in one of the most notoriously bad major film releases ever has to be commended in some senses. The detailed breakdown on his channel is a level of no-holds-barred honesty rarely seen in this kind of situation. I mean, it's not like we got a diss track response documentary from Jackie Mason after Caddyshack 2, or Jason James Richter after The Neverending Story 3.
Okay, but keep it quiet. If that's possible.
Hey, happy!
Even though it does make the life of a YouTuber editing together a video 20 years later considerably easier, Kennedy's relationship with Son of the Mask and the reaction to it doesn't seem completely healthy. Unlike its predecessor, which gets referenced to this day, Son of the Mask has been largely wiped from our collective memory. It feels a bit like Kennedy talks about it more than anyone else. It's hard to know how any of us might react in a similar situation though. I know I can't really comprehend it. I mean, it's one comparatively very small thing, reading a negative comment on your YouTube video, but that's a drop in the ocean to being held largely responsible for what is seen as one of the very worst big budget films of all time. Especially when that film had such a detrimental impact on your career. There is definitely truth to the idea that criticism can sometimes be too harsh or abusive. That trend seems to have faded somewhat, but it's pretty wild to me that I look back at films which are now acknowledged as 80s or 90s classics and see how bad the reviews for them were at the time. Like, am I watching the same movie? There will always be a fascination with films that fail so spectacularly though, and there is no denying that sometimes a movie is just objectively not good, and Son of the Mask is almost universally acknowledged as being in that category. And the whole thing is so awkward. If you played a Son of the Mask drinking game where you drank every time the film felt awkward for viewers and actors, you would be completely wasted so early in the movie that you wouldn't actually make it to the end of it. Wait a second, why have I only thought of that now? Anyway, the Mask brand itself had run out of steam by the early 2000s, and any attempts at creating a nostalgic hit 10 years on were destined to flounder when the film made was so messy and unpalatable. For a major Hollywood release, it is almost unbelievably bad. But is that really Kennedy's fault? The star and director Lawrence Guterman have both said that the final cut was very different from what they envisioned or were promised, and it was ruined by studio interference. Warner Bros. Owned New Line Cinema after the Time Warner merger in 1996, and it's not unthinkable that corporate oversight turned the whole thing into the biggest mess it had any chance of becoming. Kennedy maintains he originally saw the film as a sort of modern psychedelic Three Men and a Baby, with the baby, not him, being the main Mask protagonist, while Guterman claims an unreleased PG-13 version with a darker tone exists, which I'd actually like to see, despite really not enjoying what we did get. But even in its original form, it's hard to imagine it being a lost masterpiece. Either way, the studio had protected their investment somewhat by only putting up a percentage of the budget, with the rest provided by investors. Kennedy's Hollywood career wouldn't be as safeguarded. though he would continue making movies and TV shows, disastrous turns hosting an E3 convention event in 2007 and a live New Year's Eve TV show in 2012 would be many people's first sighting of him in years.
Video games, they've been, where are my jokes?
If a Mask sequel had been made in the late 90s, and if they'd been able to convince the stars and makers of the original to return, then things could have been different. Maybe they could have been different if the vision of the sequel's director had been realised. It definitely felt like there would have been some mileage in exploring the darker elements of the comic book on screen. Who knows? If we're honest, the Mask sequel's goose was probably cooked as soon as it lost Jim Carrey. His ability to nail both the over-the-top comedy of the Mask character and the meek everyman Stanley demonstrates his unique talent and contributed hugely to that first film being a hit. As it is, we are left with a monument of how not to make a second installment in a franchise, a movie years beyond its relevance with a seeming total confusion about who the film was actually aimed at, a lead actor unable to effectively carry the movie he's starring in, over-reliance on special effects to cover for the quality of the script. Son of the Mask really is a tough watch. It's a shame too. The Mask was revolutionary in its use of CGI, it introduced legitimate superstar actors to the world, and future films in the series had potential. But the state of that sequel snuffed that prospect out instantly, and The Mask's chance of making a cinematic comeback was lost in the ocean, never to be washed ashore again. Or was it?
Are we back? Are we back?
In 2019, Mask creator Mike Richardson talked up the idea of a female-led reboot for the film series, but nothing materialized from that. Over the last few months though, seemingly out of the blue, both Jim Carrey and Cameron Diaz have publicly stated that they would be up for a proper Mask sequel, more than 30 years after that original movie. Whether or not it's a question of too little too late, or if this reunion will even end up happening, remains to be seen. Jamie Kennedy is unlikely to get an invite if that movie does get made, and were a legitimate sequel ever released, then Son of the Mask would become even more of a forgotten artifact than it already is. As things stand today, the second Mask film remains Exhibit A for how rebooting a popular Hollywood brand can get completely out of control very quickly. Like finding a mask that grants you incredible powers, it can so easily become a poisoned chalice. Thanks for sticking around. Sequelpalooza will return soon with the full story of one of the most rebooted franchises in Hollywood history. So much so that it's getting another reboot this year. If you haven't seen any one of the 4 previous episodes of Sequelpalooza, they're all available now. Lost Blockbusters will also be returning this spring to explore 4 more films which tried and failed to become smash hits in their initial cinema run, but this time concentrating on a different decade. The next video from Culture Slice though will be covering a major modern film empire's uncertain 80s and 90s moves in Hollywood, and that is in production right now. If this kind of thing is your bag and you feel so inclined, then liking and subscribing really does help the channel out a lot with the YouTube algorithm. As we continue on the road towards 4,000 subscribers, any and all support is hugely appreciated.
Party on, dudes!
In the meantime, I hope 2025 is treating you well so far, catch you on the flip side, and of course, save Ferris.